Christopher Hernandez walked into that courtroom like he was ordering coffee. Casual, relaxed, almost bored. The judge asked him to explain what happened on December 3rd, 2021, and Christopher just shrugged and said something so sick, so twisted, that the entire courtroom went dead silent. I'm not going to tell you what he said yet, but I will tell you this. When you hear those words, you're going to understand why his own defense attorney looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. See, most killers at least pretend to be sorry. They cry, they blame drugs or mental illness or childhood trauma. They put on a show. Not Christopher, not his brother Victor. These two didn't just murder 5 people in cold blood. They murdered their own family, their sister, her children, and when they got caught, they did something that shocked seasoned detectives who'd seen everything. They smiled. But here's what nobody talks about in cases like this. Here's what the news reports never tell you. This wasn't some sudden explosion of rage. This wasn't a family fight that got out of hand. This was business. Christopher and Victor spent 4 months planning this massacre. They studied police procedures, they researched forensics. They even listened to true crime podcasts to learn how killers get caught so they could avoid making the same mistakes. They treated murdering their own flesh and blood like a school project. And for 2 years they thought they'd aced it. You think you know how dark family betrayal can get? You think you've heard the worst that brothers can do to their own blood? You haven't heard anything yet. December 3rd, 2021 started like any other Friday in Tijuana. The morning was crisp, the kind of weather that makes you want to take your time getting out of bed. In the Colonia Libertad neighborhood, kids were walking to school, parents were heading to work, street vendors were setting up their carts. JH had already been up for 2 hours by 6 a.m. That's what single mothers do. They don't get the luxury of sleeping in. She was 32, worked at a textile factory where the shifts were long and the pay was short, but she never complained. Not once. Her daughter AMM was 8 years old and had her mother's stubborn streak. That morning, she refused to eat breakfast because she wanted candy instead. JH didn't give in, she never did. She was raising her kids to understand that you don't always get what you want just because you want it. If only her half-brothers had learned that lesson. GMV wasn't the biological father of JH's children, but he'd been more of a dad to them than their real father ever was. He worked construction, came home every night covered in dust and cement, but always had energy to help with homework or throw a ball around in the tiny backyard. The 2 other children in the house that day were visiting for the weekend. I won't use their names because they were minors, but they loved staying at Tia JH's house. She always had snacks, always let them stay up a little later than their parents would. None of them had any idea that 15 miles away, 2 men were loading weapons into a stolen car. Christopher Baltazar Hernandez had been up all night, not because he was nervous, because he was excited. He'd been planning this day for months, going over every detail, every possible scenario. He was 28 years old and had already spent 6 years in and out of prison for various crimes. But this was going to be his masterpiece. His half-brother, Victor Armando Aguilar, was different. Where Christopher was methodical and cold, Victor was impulsive and violent. He was 25, built like a boxer, with scars on his knuckles from too many bar fights. He'd been arrested for domestic violence 3 times, but somehow always ended up back on the streets. Together, they made a perfect storm of violence and stupidity. The thing is, nobody saw this coming, not even their own family. See, Christopher and Victor hadn't grown up with JH. Their father had been one of those men who collected women and children like stamps, a little collection here, another family there, never really committing to any of them. JH barely knew her half-brothers until their father died in 2019. That's when they suddenly became very interested in family relationships. Their father left behind a small piece of property in Tijuana. Nothing impressive, a 1/4 acre of scrubland with a rundown house that hadn't been updated since the 1970s. But in a city where real estate was getting more expensive every year, even that dump was worth something. About $40,000 according to the most recent appraisal. JH had been living on the property with her children since 2018. She'd been the one paying the property taxes, maintaining what little could be maintained, keeping squatters from moving in. In her mind, she was taking care of family property until they could all figure out what to do with it. In Christopher and Victor's minds, she was squatting on their inheritance. The first time Christopher approached JH about selling the property, he was almost friendly about it. This was back in early 2021. He showed up at her work one day with coffee and pastries, acting like the caring big brother he'd never been. "Look, hermana," he said, using the Spanish word for sister, like it actually meant something to him. "We should sell Papa's land, split the money 3 ways. You could get an apartment in a better neighborhood for the kids." JH wasn't stupid. She knew Christopher had never shown interest in her or her children before. She knew he'd never called their father Papa when the old man was alive, and she definitely knew that if they sold that land, she'd never see a penny of her share. "I'm not ready to sell," she told him. "The kids are settled in their school. We're comfortable where we are." Christopher's friendly mask slipped just a little. "You can't just live there forever for free, JH. It's not all yours." "I'm not living there for free. I'm maintaining it. I'm paying the taxes. What have you contributed?" That was the wrong thing to say. Christopher left that day without another word, but JH noticed he didn't touch the coffee and pastries he'd brought. She should have realized then that his visit wasn't about reconciliation. It was reconnaissance. 3 weeks later, Victor showed up. He wasn't pretending to be friendly. "My brother tried to be nice," he said, standing in the doorway of the factory where JH worked. "I'm not nice. You need to sign over your rights to that property, or there's going to be problems." JH's supervisor had to escort Victor off the premises, but not before he made sure JH heard him clearly. "We know where you sleep at night. We know where your kids go to school. Think about that." That's when the text messages started. "Real quick, if you're already hooked on this story, hit that subscribe button. Cases like this take weeks to research and script, and your support helps me bring you the most twisted true crime stories every week." The text messages weren't random threats. They were psychological warfare. Christopher and Victor didn't just want to scare JH. They wanted to break her down mentally before they broke her down physically. The messages came at all hours. 3 a.m. "Can't sleep? Neither can we. We're thinking about you." During her lunch break, "Saw AMM walking home from school today. Cute backpack." While she was putting her kids to bed. "Houses catch fire so easily in your neighborhood." JH saved every message. She showed them to her neighbors, to her co-workers, even to the local police. But this is Tijuana we're talking about. The police have bigger problems than family disputes. They told her to change her phone number and install better locks. She did both. It didn't matter, because Christopher and Victor weren't just sending messages. They were watching, learning, planning. Christopher had always been the smart one in his family, but smart in the wrong ways. He could figure out how to run a drug operation without getting caught, how to fence stolen goods, how to manipulate people into doing what he wanted. Now, he was applying those same skills to murder. He started researching, not just how to kill people. Any idiot with a gun can kill people. He was researching how to kill people and get away with it. He spent hours on YouTube watching forensic science videos. He read police procedural manuals he found online. He even started listening to true crime podcasts, taking notes on where other killers had made mistakes. Victor thought his brother was overthinking it. "Just kick in the door and shoot everyone," he kept saying. "Why make it complicated?" But Christopher knew better. Random violence draws attention. Family massacres make headlines. If they were going to do this, they needed to be smart about it. That's when Christopher came up with what he called the perfect plan. First, they would make it look like a home invasion. Dress in dark clothes, wear masks, leave no fingerprints. Take some valuables to make it seem like robbery was the motive. Second, they would strike when the house was full. More victims meant more chaos, and chaos meant confused witnesses and sloppy police work. Third, they would establish alibis. Christopher would tell his girlfriend he was going to a bar. Victor would tell his friends he was working late. Simple lies that would be hard to verify. And fourth, this was Christopher's masterstroke. They would stay in Mexico for a few months after the murders, then quietly slip across the border to California, where Christopher's girlfriend lived. By the time Mexican police started asking serious questions, they'd be long gone. It was a good plan. It might have even worked. Except for one thing Christopher didn't account for. His brother Victor was an idiot. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the months leading up to the murders, because this is where you really start to see how twisted these brothers were. In September 2021, 3 months before the massacre, Christopher started showing up at JH's workplace regularly. Not to threaten her, he was smarter than that. He was gathering intelligence. He learned her work schedule. He figured out which days she got off early, which days she worked late. He found out that Fridays were her short days. She usually got home by 4 p.m. to make dinner for the kids. He also learned about GMV's routine. The man worked construction, which meant his schedule was predictable. Home by 5 p.m., dinner by 6, asleep by 10 because he had to be up at 5 a.m. Christopher even figured out which days the other children visited. It was usually weekends, but sometimes they came on Friday afternoons if there was no school the next day. He was building a target profile like he was planning a military operation. Meanwhile, Victor was getting more impatient and more violent. In October, he followed AMM home from school. Not to hurt her, just to prove he could. When JH found out, she called the police again. This time, they actually took a report. Victor was arrested and spent 1 night in jail before posting bail. That arrest should have been a warning. It should have scared the brothers into backing off. Instead, it accelerated their timeline. "Now they know we're serious," Christopher told Victor. "We can't wait much longer. She's going to get a restraining order or move somewhere we can't find her." Victor was ready. He'd been ready for months. "So when do we do it?" Christopher already had the date picked out. December 3rd, 2021, a Friday, JH's short day at work. The other kids would probably be there for the weekend. Perfect conditions for maximum impact. They spent November preparing. Christopher bought the .223 rifle from a guy he knew who sold stolen weapons. Victor already had the revolver. He'd been carrying it illegally for years. They practiced shooting at a junkyard outside the city, not because they needed to improve their aim. Both brothers had been around guns their whole lives. They practiced to get comfortable with the idea of pulling the trigger on people they knew. Christopher later told police that the first few times they practiced, he imagined shooting strangers. By the end of November, he was imagining shooting JH. "It got easier every time," he said during his confession. "After a while, she stopped being my sister in my head. She was just an obstacle." The night before the murders, they stole a car. Nothing fancy. A beat-up Honda Civic that wouldn't attract attention. Christopher had learned from his research that most killers get caught because their vehicles are spotted near the crime scene. They also bought latex gloves, ski masks, and dark clothes from different stores around the city. Christopher paid cash for everything and made sure to shop at places that didn't have security cameras pointed at the registers. December 3rd, 2021 dawned clear and cold. Christopher woke up at 6 a.m., made coffee, and reviewed his plan one more time. He'd written everything down in a notebook that he burned that morning in his backyard. Victor slept until noon, then spent 2 hours at the gym. He wanted to be loose and relaxed for what was coming. They met at 3 p.m. in a parking lot near the Tijuana airport, both dressed in black, both armed, both ready to cross a line that most people can't even imagine. "You sure about this?" Victor asked as they got into the stolen Honda. Christopher started the engine. "It's too late to back out now. Besides, they brought this on themselves." At 4:30 p.m., they parked 3 blocks away from JH's house and walked the rest of the way. They moved like they belonged in the neighborhood, just 2 guys heading home from work. Nobody paid attention to them. Why would they? They looked like everyone else. At exactly 5:15 p.m., they reached the front door of the house where JH was making dinner for her family. Christopher knocked. 3 soft taps. Nothing threatening. JH opened the door, probably expecting to see a neighbor or maybe a delivery driver. Instead, she saw 2 figures in ski masks pointing guns at her face. She didn't even have time to scream. Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear how this story ends, because what happened next is going to stay with you long after this video is over. What happened in the next 8 minutes was so brutal, so systematic, that even hardened homicide detectives had trouble reading the police reports. JH stumbled backward when she saw the guns. Her mouth opened to scream, but no sound came out. Terror does that to people. It freezes everything, even your voice. Christopher pushed through the doorway first, his rifle pointed at JH's chest. Victor followed, sweeping the room with his revolver like he'd seen in movies. "Where are the others?" Christopher demanded. JH couldn't speak. She just stood there, shaking, tears streaming down her face. That's when AMM ran into the living room. She'd heard voices and came to see who was visiting. When she saw the two men in masks, she did what any 8-year-old would do. She ran to her mother. Christopher shot them both. Not one shot each, not quick, merciful shots to the head. He emptied half his magazine into them, shooting even after they'd fallen, even after they'd stopped moving. Victor later told police that he'd never seen anything like it. Christopher just kept pulling the trigger, like he was angry at the gun for not killing them faster. The sound of gunfire brought GMV running from the back bedroom. He'd been taking a nap, probably dreaming about normal things like weekend plans or Christmas gifts for the kids. He rounded the corner and saw JH and AMM on the floor, blood spreading across the linoleum that JH had mopped that morning. GMV was unarmed, but he didn't run. He didn't try to save himself. He charged straight at the gunman, probably hoping to buy time for the other children to escape. Victor shot him 3 times in the chest. GMV dropped like a stone. But he wasn't dead yet. He was gasping, trying to say something. Victor walked over and put the gun to his head. "This is for threatening my family," he said, and pulled the trigger. Except GMV had never threatened anyone. He'd never even met Christopher and Victor before that day. That's when they heard crying from the back bedroom. The other 2 children were hiding behind the bed, holding each other, probably praying that the bad men wouldn't find them. Christopher and Victor looked at each other. They hadn't specifically planned to kill the other kids. Their original plan was just to eliminate JH and anyone who might identify them. But here they were, and there were witnesses. Christopher walked toward the bedroom. Victor followed. What happened next is the part that still gives me nightmares, and I didn't even witness it. I can't imagine what it was like for those children in their final moments. The brothers found them huddled together behind the bed. 2 kids, probably no older than 10, clutching each other like they could somehow protect each other from what was coming. Christopher later told police that the children begged. They promised not to tell anyone what they'd seen. They offered to give the men their piggy banks, their toys, anything they had. "Please don't hurt us," one of them said, according to Christopher's confession. "We'll be good. We promise we'll be good." Christopher looked down at them for a long moment. Then he raised his rifle. Victor stopped him, not because he had a sudden attack of conscience, because he wanted to do it himself. "My turn," he said. 5 people, dead in 8 minutes. The youngest was 8 years old. The oldest was 34. An entire family, wiped out by their own blood relatives over a piece of property worth $40,000. But here's the thing that really shows you how sick these brothers were. After the shooting stopped, after the house went quiet except for the sound of blood dripping onto the floor, they didn't leave. They sat down in the living room and ate the dinner JH had been preparing. Christopher later told police it was the best meal he'd had in months. "She was always a good cook," he said, like he was remembering a pleasant family gathering instead of describing the aftermath of mass murder. While they ate, they went through the house looking for valuables to steal. They found about $200 in cash, some jewelry that might have been worth another $300, and a small TV that was probably 10 years old. They loaded everything into pillowcases and carried it out to the stolen Honda. Then Christopher did something that proves just how twisted his mind was. He went back into the house and arranged the bodies to make it look like they'd been killed during a robbery gone wrong. He scattered furniture around like there'd been a struggle. He pulled out drawers and emptied them on the floor. He even broke a window from the inside to make it look like the killers had forced entry. The whole staging took another 20 minutes. 20 minutes that Christopher spent stepping over the corpses of his sister and her children, arranging a crime scene like he was decorating for a party. At 6:43 p.m. they drove away. Victor was already talking about how they were going to spend their share of the inheritance money. Christopher was quiet, not because he felt guilty, because he was already planning their next move. They ditched the stolen car in a ravine outside Tijuana, then took a bus back to the city. Christopher went to a bar and made sure several people saw him there. Victor went to his girlfriend's house and spent the night, making sure she would remember him being there. Perfect alibis. Just like Christopher had planned. The bodies weren't discovered until Sunday morning, when one of JH's co-workers got worried because she hadn't shown up for her Saturday shift. The co-worker knew JH never missed work without calling, so she went to the house to check on her. The front door was unlocked. The co-worker called out JH's name, then stepped inside. She found them in the living room and the bedroom, exactly where they'd died 2 days earlier. The co-worker's screams brought neighbors running. Someone called the police. Within an hour, the house was swarming with detectives, forensic technicians, and paramedics who had nothing to do except confirm what everyone already knew. The Hernandez family was gone. All of them. The initial police investigation focused on the robbery angle. It looked like a home invasion that had gone horribly wrong. The broken window, the scattered belongings, the missing valuables, everything pointed to random criminals who had picked the wrong house. Except for one detail that bothered Detective Maria Santos, the lead investigator on the case. The broken window was wrong. Detective Santos had been investigating home invasions for 15 years. She knew how burglars operated, how they thought, what they did when things went bad. And she knew that no burglar breaks a window from the inside. That single detail, a few shards of glass that were pointing the wrong direction, was the thread that would eventually unravel Christopher's perfect plan. But it would take 2 years to pull that thread. Detective Santos spent the first 6 months of the investigation chasing ghosts. She interviewed neighbors, tracked down known burglars in the area, even looked into JH's co-workers to see if anyone had a grudge against her. Nothing. The case went cold not because the police didn't care, but because Christopher had done his homework. He'd covered his tracks too well. But Christopher made one mistake that he didn't even realize until it was too late. He trusted his brother. Victor had never been good at keeping secrets. Even as a kid, he was the type who couldn't lie to save his life. And keeping quiet about 5 murders? That was too much pressure for his simple mind to handle. It started with small hints, comments to his girlfriend about suddenly having money to spend, jokes to his drinking buddies about taking care of family business. Nothing specific enough to raise suspicion, but enough to make people wonder. Then Victor met a woman named Carmen at a bar in Tijuana. She was pretty, she was interested in him, and she was a good listener. Too good. Carmen was actually an undercover police officer working on an unrelated drug case. She'd been tracking Victor for weeks because of his connections to local dealers, not because of the murders. But when Victor started drinking, he started talking, and when he started talking, he couldn't stop. It took 3 months of casual conversations before Victor finally told Carmen what he and his brother had done. He didn't confess directly. He was drunk, not stupid. But he said enough. He talked about how his sister had deserved what she got for being greedy. He mentioned that he and Christopher had solved their property problem permanently. He even bragged about how they'd fooled the police with their perfect alibis. Carmen reported everything to her supervisors, who passed it along to Detective Santos. Suddenly, the cold case was hot again. Detective Santos pulled Christopher and Victor's criminal records. She looked into their relationship with JH. She discovered the property dispute, the threatening text messages, Victor's arrest in October. Everything clicked into place. But knowing who killed the family and proving it in court are 2 very different things. Detective Santos needed evidence, not just suspicion. That's when she got lucky. In January 2023, Christopher's girlfriend in Fresno called the Tijuana police. She'd been living with Christopher for over a year and she was getting scared. Christopher had been having nightmares, violent nightmares where he screamed things like, "Don't let them identify us," and "Shoot them all." He'd also been drinking heavily and talking about loose ends that needed to be tied up. His girlfriend was afraid he was planning to kill again. She told the police everything she knew, including the fact that Christopher had crossed the border illegally in early 2022 and was living under a false name in California. Detective Santos contacted the FBI, who located Christopher in Fresno within a week. He was arrested on immigration charges while the Mexican authorities prepared their murder case. Victor was arrested the same day in Tijuana. He was so surprised to see the police at his door that he actually asked, "What took you so long?" Both brothers were extradited to Mexico and charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. And that's when they did the thing that shocked everyone who'd been following the case. They confessed. Not just to their lawyers in private plea negotiations, they confessed in open court, in front of cameras, with their victims' extended family members sitting in the gallery. Christopher went first. He stood up at the defense table and told the judge exactly what had happened on December 3rd, 2021. Every detail, every shot, every scream. He spoke for 45 minutes without showing any emotion whatsoever. He could have been reading a grocery list. When the judge asked him if he felt remorse for his actions, Christopher shrugged. "They brought it on themselves," he said. "If JH had just signed over the property like we asked, none of this would have happened." Victor's confession was even worse. He actually smiled while he was talking. He described shooting GMV in the head like it was a funny story he was sharing with friends. When the judge asked him about the children, Victor laughed. "Kids shouldn't have been there," he said. "Not our fault, they were in the wrong place at the wrong time." The judge called for a recess. Several people in the gallery had to be removed because they were screaming at the defendants. JH's mother, the grandmother of the murdered children, had to be carried out of the courtroom. She'd collapsed when she heard Victor laugh about killing her grandchildren. Christopher Baltazar Hernandez and Victor Armando Aguilar were both sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In Mexico, that actually means life. There's no chance for early release, no appeals that can reduce the sentence. They'll die in prison. And based on how other inmates treat child killers, they probably won't die of old age. The property that started this whole nightmare, the 1/4 acre of land that Christopher and Victor thought was worth killing for, it was sold at auction to pay for the victims' funeral expenses. It brought $35,000, less than the original appraisal. After legal fees and taxes, there was barely enough money left to buy 5 headstones. Christopher and Victor destroyed an entire family, ruined their own lives, and traumatized a whole community for less money than most people spend on a car. But here's what really stays with me about this case. It's not the violence, even though that was horrific. It's not the family betrayal, even though that was unthinkable. It's how normal these brothers seemed to everyone who knew them. Christopher had a girlfriend who loved him. Victor had friends who enjoyed his company. They weren't monsters hiding in the shadows. They were regular people who made a choice to become monsters. And that's the scariest part of all. Because if Christopher and Victor could plan and execute a family massacre over $40,000, what's stopping the next person? What's stopping someone you know? What's stopping someone you trust? The answer is nothing. Nothing except the choice to be human instead of a monster. Christopher and Victor made their choice on December 3rd, 2021. 5 innocent people paid the price for that choice with their lives. If this story affected you the way it affected me, please subscribe and share this video. Cases like this need to be remembered, not just for the victims, but as a warning about how quickly ordinary people can become capable of extraordinary evil. Justice was served in this case, but it came too late for JH, AMM, GMV, and the 2 other children who died that December evening in Tijuana. They're the ones we should remember. Not the killers who destroyed them, but the family who deserved so much better than the brothers who were supposed to protect them. Rest in peace to the Hernandez family. Your story won't be forgotten.